Thank you very much, Frank, and to Ruth and to all the faculty here at Rutgers. Thank you for the opportunity to come to you tonight. You know, I've been out of Congress a year, and any chance I get to speak to a crowd of people, I'll take it. It's something that I have a great honor to be here and to share it with my good friend Frank Pallone. You know, he's very humble about this whole process of legislating. He is a real giant in healthcare. And I want you all to know that, because tonight I'm going to talk about the science of neuroscience and how do we employ political science to neuroscience. But it's not about simply doing the research, which is going to give us the cures. It's going to be delivering the health care that we all want for our family members. And one of the principal people who got it done, and I know health care is often something that's maligned politically, I will tell you, for every family in this country who has a loved one who's suffering and is worried about the additional stress of getting insurance coverage, they need to thank Frank Pallone, because it's people like Frank Pallone who led the committee of jurisdiction in marking up health care reform. And I have a funny, sneaking suspicion that every single person in this room has a personal reason why you're here tonight and knows somebody who's been denied health care because of a pre-existing condition. I'm here to tell you, if that matters to you, then Frank Pallone matters to you, because people like Frank Pallone got it done when it was a very tough fight to take on the insurance companies. But as Ruth Mandel said to you, you know, this is an interesting time in Washington, politically. And it's not always about what gets done. It's about keeping some really bad things from happening. So you change the metrics by which you evaluate progress in this current environment in Washington. Now it's not what do you pass, it's what you keep from passing. And I want to tell you a vignette about Frank Pallone there, because there's something called the Class Act. And for every single person in this audience who has a loved one with a developmental disability, a cognitive disorder, who's suffering from a chronic illness that keeps them homebound, you know, a lot of what's going to be most meaningful to those people is not an extra pill or an extra imaging device or an extra, you know, medication. What's going to make the world a difference to them, as it did to me when my father was at home recuperating from surgery from a glioblastoma. The person that made the biggest difference in my dad's life was the guy that could pick him up out of the chair and walk him to the dining room. It was the guy that could make sure he could get on his beautiful sailboat without worrying about whether he was going to fall down. And that guy doesn't have a medical degree. That guy doesn't have any fancy titles by his name. But he was the most important guy in my dad's life and his health care. And the thing about the Class Act is about paying people for non-medical services that help people with medical conditions. So my uncle Sarge Shriver suffered from Alzheimer's, but he was the happiest guy you'd ever want to meet. And what allowed him to live at home with my cousins and my Aunt Eunice was the fact that he had someone who helps him around. I am telling you, for every caregiver that Frank Pallone just talked about, which is probably some of you in this audience, you know that one of the great deficiencies in our healthcare policy and insurance system today is that it doesn't pay for the things that we know work, that cost us nothing compared to someone having to be cared for in a nursing home or in a hospital bed, when all that it takes is someone helping them out at home. Help them with the grocery shopping. Help them with the support at home. Help them drive. I've got a good friend with Parkinson's, fully independent, but he can't drive because he gets in too many car accidents because of his neurological disorder. Guess what? Having someone drive him helps reduce our medical costs, because now he's not going to injure himself when he gets in a car accident, nor is he going to injure anybody else. But our health insurance system sure doesn't acknowledge that or pay for it. That's why we need Frank Pallone to be successful passing what's known as the Class Act. And we had everything we could do this year to keep it from getting repealed. And one of the people who was instrumental in keeping it in as law, because he fought the fight, was, again, Frank Pallone. So let's give Frank another round of applause. I want to thank all those that were helpful in organizing this. I know Jennifer, you've been a terrific help, and Randy, who helped pull this. She's already working it in the back, and I know her mom's here, but there are many people who helped make tonight possible, and I want to thank all of them as well. And I want to also acknowledge some other folks, although I'll get in trouble in politics now because I'm going to start acknowledging folks. But Kenneth Breslauer, who is head of the science department, I want to thank him for his. And Robin Davis, who's director of this new program that Rutgers is embarking on called the Brain Health Initiative. And give them a round of applause. So I love what Rutgers is trying to do, and that's what we're trying to do with advocacy, and that is, how do you integrate all this science? So about 2 years ago, I'm sitting on the board of the John F. Kennedy Performing Arts Center. And it's early in the morning, and the director says to all of us, next year we're going to celebrate President Kennedy's inauguration, the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's inauguration, and the new frontier. Well, a funny thing had happened to me the day before. I had gotten briefed by a bunch of neuroscientists who told me that the brain is the last medical frontier of discovery. So here I am in the morning having the director tell me that we're going to celebrate John F. Kennedy's new frontier. And I thought, frontier? I just heard that word, frontier. And it applied to neuroscience. So, I was a politician. I thought I could connect the dots. So I called my cousin Caroline, and I said, Caroline, can we reserve the John F. Kennedy Library on January 20th next year? Because I had this idea that maybe we can rephrase John F. Kennedy's new frontier for our generation as a way of researching the brain. And she said, oh, Patrick. She said, that's very creative. That's very creative. But, we already have the president coming, and we have the Congress, and we have everybody else, and we've got the day already scheduled out. But she said, it's not a bad idea. You know what? If you want to, why don't you take Daddy's library on May 25th? And I said, well, Caroline, what in the world is May 25th? And she said, well, that's the anniversary of when President Kennedy talked about the moonshot. And, of course, that seems like it's pretty analogous to what you want to do, right? Is that what you're telling me? And I said, yes, that's right, Caroline, thank you. So now I'm out of Congress, and no one will return my calls anymore. So I thought to myself, how am I going to get anyone to show up? Well, when you have the keys to the John F. Kennedy Library, that's pretty good. They show up. And not only did we get every director of the NIH on the National Institutes for Neurological Disorders, the National Institutes of Mental Health, the National Institutes of Addiction and Alcoholism, the National Institutes on Aging, the National Institutes on Childhood and Human. I mean, there's a dozen institutes that focus on the brain, like it's all separate, right? You have 12 separate institutes focusing on the brain at the NIH. So we got all of them. We got Peggy Hamburg, who runs the FDA, and the president would have come, but he was over in Europe, so he sent Vice President Biden to be there. And then we asked all the principal Nobel laureates and scientists in neuroscience to come to the moonshot anniversary. And so they all came. And I looked out amongst them and I said, you know who I see in this audience? I see a room full of astronauts. And I am telling you, they put their BlackBerries down, they put their iPads down, and they stood up and they listened. And afterward, I had Tom Insel, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, come up to me and said, I love being called an astronaut. He said, I grew up watching the Apollo program, and I just get so excited by that reference. And I said, Tom, we need to put an American flag on you. And you know what? We need to put it on everybody studying neuroscience. Because you're our astronauts of today. You're the generation that's going to take us into inner space of the mind and the brain and how the galaxy of neurons works. Forget the outer galaxy. Let's focus on the inner galaxy. Because that's the discovery that's going to relieve everybody. Now, we also had another guy come to the Kennedy. We had a lot of folks come that day. But one of the great lines that we had up there was Neil Armstrong gave that great quote. He said, when he landed on the moon, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I have a friend named Jim Langevin. He served, and he still serves in the United States Congress with Frank and I. When he was 19 years old, he was studying to be a police officer. And there was a tragic accident. Someone dropped a firearm, and the bullet pierced his spinal cord. He's been paralyzed from the chest down his whole life. But he got elected to statewide office in Rhode Island to the United States Congress, and he's fighting for stem cell research. If you ask me what is as powerful as Neil Armstrong taking that first step on the moon, I'll tell you it's Jim Langevin stepping out of that wheelchair for the first time because neuroscientists figured out how to reconnect the spinal cord. If we can't get a generation of Americans and the world to support the most important foundational research that will not only allow Jim Langevin to step out of his wheelchair, but will allow millions of Americans to step out of being prisoners of their neurological disorder. And obviously, first and foremost, amongst all those people who will benefit from this science, should be our American heroes, our brave men and women who answered the call to go over there so that we wouldn't have another 9/11. And now they're back. And the question for every American is, are we going to be there for them the same way they were there for us? Because frankly, there's nothing we can do to hold a candle to the sacrifice of our nation's veterans. Because ultimately, they were prepared to do something that I, myself, and I know many else in this room, wouldn't be prepared to do, and that's lay down their lives. I'm not that courageous. I'm not that strong. Thank God they're Americans, like our veterans, who answer the call and put their lives on the line. But one thing I can do is thank them, not just by attending a parade or waving the American flag, but really thank them by saying that when you get home and you're suffering from the signature wound of the war, traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, we're not going to allow you to languish. Imagine if any one of those SEAL Team 6 who went in and took out Osama bin Laden was captured by the Taliban. Do you think our country would hesitate for a nanosecond to go in there and set them free? Do you think anybody would dare to say, how much is that going to cost for us to go over to Iraq or to Afghanistan or to the million other places around the world where our young, brave men and women are serving today, and go in there and kick down the doors and grab those prisoners and bring them home? Of course it wouldn't. No one would stop. In fact, every American would put a yellow ribbon around a tree to say they were in solidarity with our military, because we don't want any American left behind on the battlefield. But you know what we're doing to our soldiers today? The ones suffering from traumatic brain injury because of improvised explosive devices, the ones suffering from trauma because they've had to fight a non-conventional war where civilians are involved and there's no clear enemy in sight sometimes, and they all suffer the consequences of that trauma. We're letting them become new prisoners of war. They're POWs, all right. They're prisoners of their war injuries. And they're being held hostage, not only by the injury that they've suffered, they're being held hostage by the shame and the stigma that exists because of these wounds of war. Now you can bet if they're missing a limb, we'll rush right on in and give them a prosthetic limb. You can bet if we can help repair their burns, we'll do that. We'll give them a wheelchair. We'll try to provide support of everything for them. But if their injury is what they call invisible wounds of war, isn't that insulting? You know, the Pentagon doesn't even give a Purple Heart for the signature wound of war. What are these soldiers supposed to think? Of course they don't think it's a real wound. They don't think it's physiological. They're told it's psychological. Well, I will tell you this. Who wants to be diagnosed with a psychological wound? That conveys it's up to them to get over it. But when you suffer trauma, your neurobiology changes. We can see this in imaging devices. So for us to say it's a, quote, invisible wound of war is insulting, not only to the great scientists here in this audience who study the brain, but it's most insulting to our veterans and to all Americans who are told that all they need to do is pull themselves up by their bootstraps. All they need to do is, shake it off. How insulting. In this day and age, we're telling our veterans that they're the ones who should be blamed for the effects of these wounds. And you know what's happening today? We're actually taking them prisoner, not only figuratively, as I've just spoken about, but literally. Because increasingly in our county, state, local, and federal jails, our veterans are amongst the fastest growing population in our prison system. And you know why? It's because we're not seeing this as a public health issue. we've criminalized their symptoms of traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. We as Americans ought to be the one under indictment. We're the ones who ought to be under indictment for the way we're treating our veterans. So I think to myself, I've been fighting for mental health, as Frank said, my whole career in Congress. I've been fighting for more research dollars. But now this issue is simple. It's not about people with autism, although I care about that, or people with Alzheimer's, although certainly I have family members who've suffered that, or people with Parkinson's, or epilepsy, or MS, or schizophrenia, or addiction, or depression. You know what? It's about saving our soldiers. Now, Frank Pallone is in a Congress that's broken. They can't get anything done. Well, I will tell you how to get every member of Congress to vote whatever you want in neuroscience, because I've already seen it happen. You show up with a guy named Kit Parker, for example. Kit Parker is a 3-tour of duty Iraq and Afghan war veteran. He comes with me. We show up. He stands 6'8", and you don't want to double cross him. But you know what he says? He says, Congressman, I was a medic in Iraq, and when one of my guys was blown up, I'd go and try to apply the tourniquet. I'd try to save their life on the battlefield. But you see, Congressman, most of them are dying today, 5, 10 years after the war, because of the wounds they suffered that day when they were injured by a rocket-propelled grenade or an improvised explosive device. But you see, they're suffering from the damage to their brains, the neurological disorders that are symptoms of what they experienced. And you know what? We all have a duty to keep running in and trying to save them, because now more and more of them are losing their life because they see no way out. It's not enough that they've got the injury. We've added insult to injury by our lack of responsiveness and by our stigmatization of these wounds. And so what's happening? Suicide rates are off the charts. Now, 50 years ago, President Kennedy did something else pretty extraordinary besides the moonshot, and that was he was the first president of the United States to address the moral outrage, as he saw it back then, in the way that we treated other Americans simply because their skin color was different. First president, the moral courage to go to this nation on a nationally televised address. And he said, who amongst us would be willing to trade the color of their skin and be content with the counsels of patience and delay? In other words, if you don't think segregation's that bad, then try living with a different skin color and see how long you'd like to be treated like a second-class citizen. Well, thankfully, America's conscience was raised, and America responded and said, if it's not good enough for me and my family, it's not good enough for any. We wanted to follow the golden rule, and that's treat others as we ourselves would want to be treated. So we had to do a lot to ultimately get to a day where we did better by it, but we're surely not even close to being done with that great vision. But I will tell you where we are today in a new civil rights fight, and that's to not hold it against people purely because of biology and pre-existing condition added by environment that makes them susceptible to a neurological disorder, as real as if the color of their skin had been a source of discrimination. Today, their neurological disorder is a source of discrimination. Because we all know about Plessy versus Ferguson, when the Supreme Court said, oh, yeah, it's okay, separate but equal. And then came another Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, and said, separate but equal is unequal. And you know what? Some of our worst enemies are ourselves in mental health, because we looked for carve-outs years ago. But when the reality is today, what's keeping us from getting true equality, i.e. parity, is the fact that we are seen as something akin to cosmetic surgery by the medical system. It's looked upon as being an extra. And frankly, when we passed the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act in 2008, think about that for a second. 2008 was when your Congress and the President said the brain was part of the body. It was just a couple of years ago. And we don't even have that law implemented today. So by all standards, it's still all right to charge higher co-pays, deductibles, and premiums for mental illnesses as compared to any other physical illness, simply because the organ that we want to treat is in the neck up, as opposed to the neck down. You can't make this up. But it is the fact. And you know what people say? How was it that we had, it took so long for civil rights to happen? It wasn't because we somehow woke up and said, hey, this is the right thing to do. It was because people marched, and they advocated, and they stood up for their rights. So what we need to do as advocates, as consumers, is say, I'm not going to be treated like a second-class citizen anymore. When my insurance company rejects me because of their medical management practices. If you're a child with autism and they say no more speech therapy, that's not neurological. If you're a parent who's worried about their parent who has dementia, oh, sorry, that's not medical the way these support services like counseling that you might need to get through it. Sorry, that's not medical. Let alone if you suffer from one of the debilitating illnesses called addictions in this country, and the stigma that applies to them, forget about it. They're not even going to think about reimbursing for that, because they first say, well, that stuff, we can't cure that. It's problematic. Nothing works. Of course it doesn't work, because you're not paying for the right thing. If we treated diabetics the way we treat alcoholics, we'd be waiting until they had to have their toes cut off and lost their eyesight before we treat them under our medical system. They don't know about the chronic nature of addiction. But I can guarantee you we're going to get better outcomes with proper primary care, proper chronic-based care, proper supportive care for addiction, the same as we get, if not better, for diabetes. And until we reimburse a new paradigm of care, we're not going to get the outcomes, and hence no one's going to be justified to pay for this stuff. But I'm telling you, the only way this is going to happen is if people stand up. And unfortunately, a lot of people feel so stigmatized by their illness that they won't stand up for themselves. Now, as Frank knows, if it's Breast Cancer Week, thanks to a lot of great work that's been done over the years, we have to find that extra big room that Ruth mentioned. That Ruth Mendel mentioned, how great Frank is, he got that extra big room for us. Because you know what? We need a big room for all the breast cancer survivors that are coming down to advocate. But when Frank and I have Mental Health Awareness Week, we can look out our door and look down both sides of the hall and wonder when they're going to arrive. Because God bless Mental Health America and NAMI and everything else, but they've got a big yoke to hold. The fact of the matter is, this thing is so stigmatizing, you rarely get anybody willing to show their face. And why? Who wants to be identified with this illness? And furthermore, then you have the medical system lay on top of it when they come in for care. And sorry, that's a mental illness. Go down and drink from the colored water fountain. Because frankly, that's our mental health system. It's the colored water fountain. Sorry, folks, I don't want any mental health system anymore. I want health care, not mental health care. I want health care. Because when you got something wrong with you, you go into your doctor to ask. They check your blood pressure, they take your temperature, they look at your diastolics. Why aren't they checking the organ that's going to have more impact on your health than any other organ? Because they're not trained, they don't know what to do, and we don't have reimbursement. And it's all interchangeable in terms of what order that comes in. But no wonder no one gets the proper care because they're afraid to. Because if I want mental health care, I got to go down to that colored water fountain. I got to go down to the psychiatrist. I got to go down to that psychologist. I mean, I don't want to do that. I don't feel that bad. But I have asthma too. You know what? And when I have an asthma attack, because I'm not taking my meds, and I get too much stress in my life, I go right to that emergency room. And I don't have to read about myself the next day in the newspaper either when that happens. But you know what? If I don't take my medicine to keep me sober, and I go out and have too many because I'm not managing my stress, and I'm not managing those things that I know are going to put me in a slippery slope, then you can bet all of you are going to read about Patrick Kennedy. Because my illness is not treated the same as my other illness. But frankly, the care for asthma is the same as what I need for my depression and addiction. It's maintenance, it's protection, it's support. But you know what? We pay for people like me, in and out of rehabs. Then they get out. We don't give them anything. And what do we expect them to do? They're not on their meds. They're not getting their medications. For me, my meds are going to 12-step meetings. But, you know, we've got a new way of thinking about this, and we got to get to that. And I'm saying to you tonight that what we're doing with One Mind is not only doing research into neuroscience and the biology of the brain, but we need to implement the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act so that we can pay for the right treatments that we know will work tomorrow if they're paid for. So I know many of you don't want to wait 10 years. And the last people we need to make wait are our veterans. So my uncle told a story, and I'll conclude with this. He said he read about a French marshal who went to his garden, and he said, I'm thinking about planting a tree. How long is it going to take for that tree to bloom? And the gardener said, sorry, sir, that tree is going to be 100 years before it blooms. And the French marshal, Léoté, said to his gardener, then plant it this afternoon. I don't know when we're going to get to the cure, but I sure hope that if we put our mind and passion and engineering and energy to the effort the same way we did to go to outer space, I should think we'll get there a lot sooner than if we don't. So the real question is, how long do you want to wait? And as my uncle said to a generation, waiting for justice, waiting for an end of discrimination. Who amongst us would trade places and be content with the counsels of patience and delay? If it's your brother, sister with an addiction, with schizophrenia, epilepsy, with Parkinson's, with Alzheimer's, how long do you want to wait? We don't have time. When are we going to say, we're not waiting, we want it now? And unless we get a group in Washington that knows what we're asking for. And that's the mission of One Mind, to come up with the ask. So I can go to Frank Pallone and I say, you know, I know exactly what we want. We want to change this about FDA. We want to change this about NIH. We want to change this about HHS. We want to change this about global agreements. We want to do this with the intellectual property laws that prevent this. We want to do this with the, you know what, that's our agenda. I don't know it yet, but I do know this. We got to come up with an agenda. And it's going to be an agenda that unites all of us, whether your child is autistic or your grandparent has Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Eunice Kennedy Shriver. She has her name emblazoned on an institute at the NIH called the National Institute for Childhood and Human Development. It was started because of her sister, Rosemary, my aunt, had a developmental disability. The fundamental work of the National Institute on Children uncovered the foundational breakthroughs that lead us today to have hope in treating Alzheimer's. Are you kidding me? You mean kids were the answer to their grandparents? Because by studying the neurodevelopment of children with Down syndrome, we found out the answers to treating their grandparents with dementia? How ironic that my aunt's husband, my Uncle Sarge, died of Alzheimer's. But all my cousins today who watched him die know that because of the early work that was done on behalf of their aunt, they had a better chance of surviving the disease that took their father. You can't make this up. It just shows that by researching any particular disorder in the brain, you understand things that can apply to all disorders of the brain. And until we're thinking about how do we apply the science in this, a way that is agnostic to what we call these diseases, when they all affect the same organ in the body, then, my friends, we're not going to reach the day soon enough because we're going to be too busy being siloed and fractionalized, which, of course, is why the subject of my speech is the political science of neuroscience. Because I grew up believing that you're a lot stronger united than you are divided. That's pretty elementary, but that's not the guiding principle in the science of the brain in a way that could mean the most difference in us finding solutions. So until we change the incentives and we know what we want to change in the science, we're going to still be going along as status quo. And I don't know about you, but I believe we had too many people in our country sacrifice too much for us to sit by and say status quo is good enough. I, for one, am going to say it's not good enough. And I hope after tonight you join me and go online with onemindforresearch.org and watch as we grow. And hopefully, if with your support, we can grow faster than we would without it. And so I'd ask you to spread the word for us. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Now, they say that I'm here till 8:30, so that means half an hour of questions. And I'll try not to make my answers as long as my speech, but keep in mind, I'm a recovering politician, too. So when I get a chance to speak and see all these smiling faces, I'm going to just keep talking. Anyway, sorry.
So we have 2 microphones that Jennifer and I will be passing around, so just let us get to one of you to get a question out.
What is it about the law that was passed that is preventing it from being implemented?
Well, us. I met with my insurance commissioner in Rhode Island. He said, I'm not getting anyone complaining about denials. He said, I hear from the providers. You know, Bradley Hospital will say Blue Cross isn't paying them enough. But I'm not hearing from the people. And I said, well, that we got to fix. Because if this is looked at as a financial remuneration issue by healthcare providers, then by God, we're never going to win this. We got to make this about people. And guess what? In the process of standing up for oneself, it's also part of their own recovery. So by standing up to those insurance companies who say, no, 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 believe me, every time they say yes, yes, yes back is empowering. This is a twofer. Not only are we going to get people get reimbursed, but they're going to feel better about themselves because they're not going to take it any longer when people say, you're not worthy. Hell, you're not. You're my sister. You're my brother. You're my aunt, my mom, or dad. I demand nothing less than the best. And the way you're treating our people is like denying my family member dignity. So every time at United or Anthem or Blue Cross or Cigna or any of them say, no, we don't think that fits our medical management portfolio, we got to show up. And guess what? Amongst those people that they're going to be denying, over half of our nation's veterans will never go to the VA in their lifetime. Principally those that don't have a visible wound, but who are suffering internally. So every time, they don't know. United, they've got some actuary or someone in a computer, they don't get the care. Guess what's going to happen when United just denied a 3-tour of duty Iraq veteran? If we're organized, we're going to be out there in Minnesota on their front steps with veterans from here to there saying, what is it with this company called United? I thought they said they were united. But they're leaving the people that gave us our country behind. What kind of, I don't know, I don't want to be united when that day happens. Like I wouldn't want to be Blue Cross, Anthem, or any other insurer that says, according to their medical model, this doesn't match up. Not when we know what we know about science today. They can't do that anymore. But the key to implementing parity is going to be giving our policymakers who want to do the right thing the ammunition. Because right now, the only people that are arguing with them are insurance companies. Oh, you can't put that screening on your health plan. That's going to cost an extra $1.75 per patient. Yeah, but it's going to save you $3.75 per patient every year out from this. It's going to be the best money you spent is prevention and early intervention in a lot of these. But that's not our reimbursement policy now. It'll only happen when we stand up and say, we want it changed. I'm at the whim of the microphone here. So.
Congressman Kennedy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Congressman Kennedy,
Oh, yes.
50 years ago, I had the privilege of hearing your father give a very important talk to a group of pharmaceutical research scientists in New York City when he was a freshman in the Senate.
Yes.
And he challenged them to develop drugs for mental health. And you're following now in his footsteps, and congratulations.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
First, I'd like to say thank you. I'm a disabled veteran from the Gulf War whose father died on the streets due to mental illness, and I have bipolar I disorder, addiction, and PTSD, and I am a national behavioral health care advocate that will actually be in Pittsburgh when you keynote for the American Psych Nurses. I keynoted in 2010, and I'll get a national award for what I do. And the desire that I hear that you talk about, I call them domestic POWs, people
Yes,
trapped here.
absolutely.
And to find that message and to know that I'll never save my father, but that, politics, an issue not addressed is not an issue. So when somebody sheds a light on this and somebody can sit there and see the traumas linked and understand how many of our veterans are dying on the streets and in the VAs, and I go in there, you're the first voice that's ever congruently spoken exactly what I'm doing, and I look forward to seeing you in
Thank
Pittsburgh
you.
this year.
Thank you for your
very much.
service.
Thank you.
Hey, I just wanted to echo actually some of the sentiments expressed earlier. I also, on a personal level, was just incredibly moved by this struggle that you're speaking in hopes, perhaps, of overcoming. So I think that's fantastic. I guess just for the sake of argument,
Sure.
one of the things that you raised that I thought was interesting was this idea that in some ways we might be stronger united than divided. And I wonder just how true that might be in all circumstances, whether there might be any risk of eliding some of the pretty significant differences between, say, PTSD and any of the other sort of neurological traumas that people are facing, alcoholism, the list goes on and on and on.
Sure. Good question. You know, the brain is a complex organ. It's not going to be one thing that solves any of them. Dementia, Alzheimer's is a spectrum. Autism is a spectrum. Frankly, a lot of the neuromotor disorders are spectrums. And certainly addiction and depression are part of a spectrum. There's no way like finding a statin in your heart, you know, this is going to be what this is about. This is about a mosaic of various issues for each and every one of us. We're not a one-size-fits-all. This brain is so complex, it's going to be the ultimate manifestation of quote-unquote personalized medicine, where we find out what your genetic type is. Then we find out what your phenotype is. That's your experience. Then we start doing the research and finding out how do you metabolize the metabolome. What's the proteome say? What's the connectome say? And we marry all the science from genome to connectome to phenome. I mean, it just goes on and on. We need a supercomputer to do this, because ultimately scientists will do parts of this, but they're never going to be able to see the pattern recognition that identifies you as not just having simple Parkinson's or simple dementia, but having a little bit of this, a little bit of that, having 3 or 4 different genetic factors on board, different, environmental. It's really going to be enhanced. Ironically, we're going to be able to go to inner space because we came up with the computers that allowed us to go to outer space. So this is about what Dan Golden, the longest-serving NASA director, said to me. It's about systems analysis, systems integration. I said, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But I think I understand, and that is, you got to get all of this different science to talk to each other, and then figure out how you get the big picture. And sure, there's going to be plenty of space for the individual scientist in the individual lab. But for us not to be looking at larger data sets, larger, if I'm not comparing my, population with schizophrenia with the population on Alzheimer's with the population of, MS, I'll be missing crucial, clues to treating my patients that are in my care. So this is really about using the modern tools. The genome is a new modern tool. The informatics revolution is a modern tool. This cloud sourcing stuff, modern tool. Imaging today, which allows us to look at all this stuff, modern tool. So science as we know it's changing every day. And if we're not advancing because we're not using all these great tools and integrating them, then we're missing the forest from the trees. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Are there particular centers that are doing neurological research in these areas?
Well, there's plenty of great research, but there's only some places that are integrating, which is the operative difference here. There's science across different dimensions and studies. to see the fuller picture. Rutgers is one of those places. So the advantage here is we need to take what Rutgers have and then marry it to what's going on over in Geneva or over in Melbourne, Australia, or partner up with what's going on in Shanghai. Because you know what? We're going to be even stronger based upon the alliances we make. Because at the end of the day, the people who are going to have the most cutting-edge science are going to be the people who've got more partnerships, which, by the way, is foreign to academics. Because it's all mine, 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 mine. I got to get my report published in Nature. I can't have that. Well, not in the future. You want your name on anything, you better be partnered, because you're going to be missing all the great discoveries if you're in your little silo and saying, no, no, I got my own science. It doesn't matter what everyone else is doing. So it's a paradigm change. I want to point, but I've got the microphone as my... Yes.
So from the political science perspective, when you're trying to think about, I know that you've talked about the strategies are still emerging, how are you thinking, or how should we be thinking in the sense of, are some of the efforts going to be institution-based about the way we organize education or research when we put together our program projects, for example? Or are you, or parallel, thinking about reorganizing the way NIH works? Or is this simply going to be a financial thing? They've got to get Congress to put together, work around the edges. I mean, these are very different fronts, and yet it seems to me all these working pieces are going to need to change in some way. I mean, I don't know if you're conceptualizing that yet.
Well, the NIH is already in the process of coming up with a program where they're identifying disorders based upon common domains. So they literally have a metrics where they have genotype, phenotype, this and that. They got, all the science down on this side. And they're saying, hey, guess what? This schizophrenia or this type 2, type 1, bipolar's got a lot of overlap on this pie chart with common mechanisms as people suffering from schizophrenia, as people having this spectrum on the autism, because it mimics a lot of this. NIH is already in the midst of doing it. Where does Rutgers come in? The sooner you get to doing science that organizes research along the way that they're going, the sooner you're going to get your payday. Because you're not going to be stuck doing it in the old way, which isn't going to be what's eligible for funding. And frankly, I think the foundations that are going to raise the lion's share of the global money behind this are going to be funding science in an integrated way. So if you're not thinking about how all these things connect, you're not going to be the recipient of, I frankly think the money is coming. I don't know when it's going to get here, but when it does, you want to be paddling that surfboard. I'm down there on the Jersey Shore now, Frank. I'm paddling because I see that wave. It's coming to shore. I want to catch it. If I just sit on my board, that wave's going to go right underneath me. But if I paddle, 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 and I catch that wave, boy, am I going to get a ride. That's the way you should be looking at it, because this is going to be big. I know no one's got money now, but believe me, every day this time bomb called Alzheimer's is going off in America, every family. Every day our veterans are dealing with dementia, and depression, and addiction because of their... It's going to happen, and we're not going to be able to pay for the care. We better start curing some of these things. And the sooner we make that investment, the more we avert a financial catastrophe. Frankly, I've got the best deficit reduction plan that Washington's never seen. Getting cures for CNS issues. I mean, you can cut all the programs you want. We're never going to be able to dig our way out of the red ink when we have the incident rates of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and addiction and aging out of autism that we have coming down our pike. So the question is, do we sit on our hands, or do we go to it and come up with a cure faster than we would otherwise? Yeah, Robin.
Patrick, I just want to punctuate. So I just want to say that I'm a neuroscientist and one of the co-founders of the Brain Health Institute. And I'm sitting here hearing what you're saying about various similarities between different neurological diseases. And I'd like to punctuate that. I think that's exactly what we're thinking. With the Brain Health Institute, we're looking at different diseases, but we're allowing the scientists to talk with one another and really realize what the common mechanisms are. In fact, Manny DeSico-Bloom, Cheryl Dreyfus, and Carl Harrop here, who are all here, who are scientists working in autism, Alzheimer's, and MS, all talk with each other all the time. We see that you're right, that NIH is changing its mechanism, and we're getting ready to do that at Rutgers. But let me also say that we can use your help in talking with the pharmaceutical industry into allowing us to have the funds that go beyond what NIH can give us to allow for very high-risk projects, which at this point I think are needed to make those major jumps in these areas that have been so difficult to tackle. And I think we've been dealing with that, but I think maybe you can give some comments about how that outreach might be a little bit more successful.
So right now, getting a drug for the brain approved is like on an order of magnitude so much more difficult than getting a drug for cardiovascular disease or cancer. So drug companies are making a strategic decision. Where's the money? It's where they had the longest patent life and the best chance of a cure. That's not in the brain. It's in cancer, it's in cardiovascular, it's in these other things. So the financial incentives to go do the research in the brain are not aligned with all of your interests. So we've got to come up with a new paradigm that says, okay, we're like the AIDS community. Guess what they said? They said, we can't wait. The alternative is not an option. Failure is not an option. We need this now. And guess what? We came up with now you can live pretty much equal longevity with HIV. What a difference from 20 years ago. So, but that meant that the community said, we're going to take whatever you got on the table, because frankly, the alternative is, and what we need to do as advocates is come up with the moral hazard. What are we willing to accept? Because if we want perfection, then we're going to be waiting our whole lives. If we want good possible, then we can get something in the near term. And then we can become partners in science, because what they learn is going to help me save my child. So that means something to me, because I want to be partner in this. So we got to change the whole mechanism. So we got to get everybody to give blood. So imagine if giving blood meant not only just donating blood to your blood bank, but donating your genetic profile to a research institution. Because you're a family member, you're a client, you're a patient with a particular set of issues. All of which is going to be part of the great data input that gives us a picture of how to treat maybe not your illness, but your family's, illness. So this means everybody has a role to play. We can't wait for pharmaceutical companies to come up with clinical trials. We need to do like Sergey Brin's wife did with 23andMe. We need to be part of the solution, making it easier, because we're partners. We can't just wait for them to come up with we got to influence what they do and what their science is, and it's not going to happen. I've got the most powerful contribution. It's not just the dollars I can give, it's the genetic profile and experience and phenotype that I can give to a researcher. That's the real, holy grail of research. So you want to get pharmaceuticals, you've got to de-risk these drugs so that they're not having to worry about, oh my God, we're going to put, how many billion down and only have a 2% chance of success. We got to increase their chance of success. We got to change the curve by which by the time we get the answer, we got to change all of that. But it's doable. But you see, in this environment, people aren't interested. They are interested in simple answers because you only have 30-second soundbite. How are you going to explain this? That's why I think we explain it by just saying we're going to be for the veterans who are there for us, end of story. I don't need to go into neuroscience everybody gets these veterans are suffering from traumatic brain injury and PTSD. And they don't know what it means, but they know they don't want them to wait and suffer any longer. I'll get every Republican and Democrat in the Congress to vote for this. You tell me what it is, how long is it going to take, what you're going to do, and I'll get the money, period. But we got to come up with the ask so we know what to go to the members of Congress and say this is what we need to support.
And in the interest of getting the congressman back to the shore at a reasonable hour, I think we'll take our last 3 questions. I know we have one in the front, one from the gentleman here, and then one for the woman.
You mentioned the political science nature of the issue. How important do you think getting the new national health care law implemented, given the constraints that might put, or boundary conditions on what the insurance companies can deny, as well as extending universal coverage? And I'm sorry, and the converse, if it doesn't, if it's able to be killed because administrations change or the Supreme Court overrules it.
Well, like everybody, this is a health care debate more than anything else because it's either sick care, health care, or you're paying for it anyway. It's just that you don't know it because when you have private insurance and you go pay your bill, you're paying for everyone who doesn't have private insurance. We're all paying for this anyway. Do you want to pay for it in a more efficient way? By insuring everybody, where you can pay for preventive care that's going to really pay big dividends, and primary care, or are you going to just wait and pay for everyone as they come through the emergency room door? That's a different argument. And frankly, yes, if we don't win on the broader issue, we're going to be in trouble on this issue because ultimately the best value patient is someone with a neurological disorder. And I mean by neurological, I mean everything from MS and epilepsy to depression and addiction. It's all brain-based. So they're the highest cost patients, but they're also the highest opportunity patients, if you will, through our healthcare system to get not only better care, but savings, because Lord knows we're not paying for their care in a way that's remotely economical today. But we're only going to make that case when we get the metrics where everybody they can't just dump patients. They can't cherry pick. So the essence of healthcare is that everybody's community rated. My dad on his Mass card had Matthew 25. That Jesus said the only part of the Bible is you want to be there for these, the least of one of these, my brothers and sisters, you're there for me. So the fact is it could be any one of us. But by looking out for everybody, we all benefit because at the end of the day, who knows who it's going to be next that fate has suffering from one of these things. And wouldn't you be better off if you cared about your brother or sister or cousin with one of these? Because you know what? It could be you tomorrow. All it takes is you pulling. It's a tragedy waiting to happen for every one of us and our family members. So we can't wait. Because it's your brother and your sister that you have to worry about. And I'll just, on the stigma and everything else, just once again, I want to thank Nancy Herman for this lecture, for the Albert Lewitt lecture. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, love that. I love it. Well, it's the... Yes, it's called... You bet, Nancy. Thank you. It's called the Golden Rule. Treat others as you yourself would want to be treated. That's it. And Nancy met my dad with Mrs. Rosalind Carter. And, of course, my dad didn't really get along with Jimmy Carter that well. But I had Mrs. Carter come testify for the parody. And she came to the hearing, and all the TV cameras came in, and they said, Mrs. Carter, who do you support in the primary, Senator Obama or Senator Clinton? And I'm like, oh my God. I'm going to lose my headline, which is her saying that she's for parity. Now they're going to run back and file their story that she says whatever she's going to say, whether to support Hillary or Barack. And I thought, oh my God, we're not going to make any news when she comes into the hearing. And Mrs. Carter didn't miss a beat. She goes, I support Patrick Kennedy for president. So she is still just a dynamo and champion of mental health. And, you know, I just want to say it's an honor to have you tell me that story about my dad and Mrs. Carter, because when I went to my dad that night, I said, you won't believe this, Dad. The Carters are supporting me for president. Of course, my dad was like, oh, I don't know if I want to hear this. He was. Well, how do you think I got this far in politics? It was that good looks and personality that won it over for me. Had nothing to do with my last name being Kennedy whatsoever. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Congressman, thank you very much for being here. And you know, you mentioned a bunch of the Rutgers researchers that are here doing the science aspect. And the other thing is that we have a center with over 40 therapists that provide mental health care to people, including recovery housing, which I think you'd be thrilled to hear and learn about. My question, though, is that you know, PTSD, before it was shell shock, before that was battle fatigue, before that soldier's heart. It's all these different names. And so now they're finally saying, okay, it's an Axis 1 disorder, we're going to treat it. The reason I liked the thing I liked the most about your speech tonight was that, like, you got pissed off at stuff. And I spent a lot of my time angry, thinking about how things are wrong. And so you got up there and you're pissed off, and I like that. So one more thing to be pissed about I'm going to give you, and maybe you can talk about, is that as I'm also a private practice provider, and so, like, the military will ask private practice providers to say the soldier has an Axis 2 condition. So what they're saying is, we don't treat borderline personality disorder antisocial because it's untreatable. And so please say that your soldier who has PTSD has borderline, and then we don't have to pay for it. And that's the thing that's going on. And so they're re-stigmatizing, or they're saying, okay, yes, you do have it, but it's something else, and we don't have to pay for it. So it's just, you know, moving her already not to pay. So please get pissed off. Please go and rail about that too as well.
And you know what? You're right. And that was on the front page of the New York Times about 2 weeks ago. And I think it probably pissed a lot of Americans off when they read that story. And it is true. But now they're feeling the heat. But what that's the lesson of is that we need to stand up everywhere. Because today it's Axis 2, tomorrow it's some medical management practice that denies something else. So you can't micromanage discrimination. You either nip it in the bud or you're going to have to face it in every way possible. It'll be like the whack-a-mole. Every time you knock one down, something else is going to come back. So that's why we all got to stand for each other. It's not just Alzheimer's and their denial. It's autism and their denial, and it's PTSD, their denial. We're all in this together when we think about what we have at stake. It's pretty common. By the way, Rutgers is a leader, and also you have sober dormitories. And you're one of the real leaders in this country for providing a safe and recovering place for people. And that is to be admired, because I think that's the future. If we could prevent binge drinking and all the rest until later in life, all the signs show that we can reduce dramatically incidences of alcoholism and addiction long term. It's coming in early. It's like what we did with tobacco. We got to do the same thing with alcohol and say, listen, we have to have a moral hazard here. We're not going to permit this because it's going to hurt you dramatically. And unless we get those things, and Rutgers is getting it out there, and it's important we all say, anybody you know that's suffering from stress or depression, you got to ask them what they're thinking of doing about it. Suicide claims, too many lives in this country, 1,400 on college campuses. It's the second cause of death for college students. So, one of the things you can do tonight is we'll have posted a number of the great available tools. Your Lifeline, www.ulifeline.org, which is about In the veterans case, they have www.halfofus.com. It's all about loveislouder.com. There's a bunch of really good resource tools that universities need to make more available to all the college students and graduate students, because they have a lot of stress and they have to have people know that people love them and care about them. That's the best answer to all of these disorders, is love. It's the single cure for everything. But we need to make sure people know it, because too many people feel isolated and alone. And hopefully you guys can take that message home too for the young people that often feel no way out in college. Yes.
Congressman Kennedy, I think I'm the last question. I think that research is, is that okay? I think research and what you're doing is so key. But aside from the research, alongside of the research is a huge public education campaign, getting the awareness out there. Because only when you have the awareness out there do you reduce the stigma and do you get the research dollars. And everyone's saying about our veterans, we care about our veterans, we care about our veterans. But most people don't even know what traumatic brain injury is. Most people don't even know that. And I think you have to get out in the media. That's the key of even getting your whole foundation successful. Getting out in the media, using your name, because I know this, being head of a charitable foundation about epilepsy and seizures. And the way to do it, I agree with you, is with the veterans. Because everyone could be not united, but everyone is united behind our veterans. Everyone. And that's what we have to do. Start with the veterans, get the media campaign out there, and then the research dollars will start rolling.
Love it.
May I just make, I'm sorry,
Sure, no.
I know you have to leave, and I thank you for that. I just wanted to make an announcement, and hopefully some of our students are still here, that Mrs. Rosalind Carter is offering a $10,000 scholarship to journalists who are writing about mental illness. So I just wanted to get that in before leaving. I have to go and grade papers, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make that announcement.
Thank you. Thank you very much.